Hey friends, welcome back to the Juan Palomino Breakthrough Podcast. I'm Jenna and I'm here with my husband, Juan.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back.
Today's conversation is one we all need, even if we don't always recognize it. We're talking about grief, and not just the kind we associate with losing a loved one, but the kind of grief we experience in everyday life, when something ends, changes, or never becomes what we hoped for. Juan, a lot of people think grief is just about death, but how would you define grief in a broader sense?
That's a great question. Grief is the pain of letting go. That's how I would define it in a short sentence. But if I continue to talk about it, there's emotion behind it, right? So there's an emotional process that we walk through when something that's meaningful to us, it ends or it changes. And that could be, like you said, it could be a relationship. It could be a season of life. That could be a dream that you aspired to achieve, or even an identity, who we used to think that we were, who we used to carry or think that we were. So that's what I think grief is.
Can you share a time when you grieved something that wasn't a death, but still felt like a loss?
It was a death. It was death to my old self, my old identity. So I used to sell real estate back in the days. And when I mean back in the days, this is like 15, 16 years ago. And so I worked really hard at getting my real estate license here in the state of California. I began to do what real estate agents do, look for properties, go look at houses. I immersed myself. I'm going to use that word. I immersed myself into becoming not just a normal real estate agent, but the number one real estate agent. And so I ate, I drank, I slept, I dreamt real estate. Homes would just pour out of my pores. And so I did well by the grace of God. I did financially really well, making multiple six figures a year. I started a real estate school with my dad, and in his company, he was the broker. Anyways, long story short, I was a real estate agent. The words that I would use is I am a realtor. We've had this debate, everyone. Is it realtor or realtor?
Realtor.
Anyway, so 2008, 2009 recession hit. Maybe everybody remembers that. It was a world recession. And I lost everything. And when I mean I lost everything, I'm not talking about materialistically. Even though I did lose that, I lost tons of real estate, millions of dollars of it, expensive cars, all that stuff. Again, not to impress anyone, just to answer your question. But what I lost, when I mean I lost everything, was my identity. I had this crisis, everyone, of not being able to go to work anymore because real estate wasn't selling. There was a crisis, financially, from lending side to homes were not selling. Everything was upside down. Homes were not valued at what they were valued. Something that was supposedly on the market at $600,000 was now worth $400,000 just a year or 2 years later. And so in the midst of all of that, I had to grieve the loss of who I thought I was. And that took years, everyone. It wasn't just overnight. Losing my identity of being this all-star real estate agent that had success in the worldly sense, financially, to owning stuff and all of that. And so I had to grieve that. I had to die to that old person, that old identity that I had created about myself.
Did you know at the time that you were grieving it? And do you think that having that label of grieving makes a difference?
Well, like they say, you have perfect vision looking back. But when I was going through it, that's, again, a good question. I didn't know what was going on because, again, I wanted to go to the office. I wanted to sell real estate. I wanted to show properties, but everything was against me. I mean, I went into the whole, helping people, trying to help people buy homes at low cost and, whatever pricing and all that stuff. But I firmly believe that God was shifting, me out of that. Or I would let me say it this way, sifting me out of that to, transition me to something else. but I was fighting it. I was resisting it because all I knew was what I knew. And so I had this empty like pit in my stomach that I felt like something was missing. I fell into some depression, and I had a crisis. I had a crisis really in my hands. And on top of that, I was being stripped of everything materialistically. So the cars left, the homes left, we had to close the real estate offices. All of this was, I was seeing it visually, but I was feeling it also emotionally, psychologically. And then obviously materialistically, my bank account, right, revealed to me that, this was being all stripped away. Mm-hmm. And so it was this loss of who I was. Mm-hmm. And so I couldn't label it grief. I fought it for so long. I was in denial, if you will, that's who I was, or that I was losing myself, losing that person. If that answers it, I was losing myself.
Yeah, I think because when you lose a loved one, it's easier to know that you're going through grief, mm-hmm. right? And it's easier to label it, not that it makes it any easier to go through it, obviously. Mm-hmm. But when there's a label for it, I think it helps you understand the process that you're going through a little bit better than being lost.
Sure. And not putting a name on it, not labeling it like you said. Mm-hmm. I think during that time I had to really grieve who I was in that space, mm-hmm. and what that community meant, because my friends, my relationships, my network revolved around real estate. Mm-hmm. And then all of that was gone. And so I had to grieve that as well. So the community that I had built, even again, the version of myself, who I thought I'd keep being, all of that was grief. I had to grieve all of that because there was so much loss in that. Mm-hmm. It was crazy. One thing is losing, a relationship. Well, I mean that too, because then you lose a lot of stuff that's tied into it, right? Community, other relationships, and all that stuff. So, but yeah, it's just it was really me trying to move forward, being the same person, yet everything had changed. Can you imagine that?
And I think you're right about once you're able to put a label on it. So, for example, I had a friendship that had been broken. And so I knew that I was grieving that friendship. And so knowing that I had that, I guess you would say, label of grieving that friendship, it helped me to process it faster. I guess it was more like a closure of like, okay, I have to grieve this and then move on, instead of just kind of like, oh, this friendship is broken and I don't know what's happening and I'm mm-hmm. lost in the space.
Yeah, or fixing it or holding on to it.
Right.
The more you hold on to it and don't accept that the end has come, mm-hmm. oh my gosh, then the grief is longer.
Right.
I mean, you still get glimpses of it. I grieved for a very long time, that time in my life, because mm-hmm. I wasn't ready to let go of some of those pieces.
Right.
Even a couple of years later, I confess, I would say, was that like 10 years later, I tried to go back to real estate. Because I thought, I'll make another run. And then God was like, no, I closed that door for you, Juan. I told you to move on. And there's a whole other cool story on that. We can talk about some other time about it.
Yeah. So why do you think that so many of us try to skip grief or minimize it?
Oh, gosh. I've coached so many people over the last decade, and it's uncomfortable. We don't like pain. None of us do. No. We're so uncomfortable with pain. And honestly, we often feel like we shouldn't be sad. Mm. If we have tears or if someone says, hey, what's wrong with you? What do we say? Nothing. Especially, here's the thing, especially if we chose the change. We're like, I don't want to be sad. I chose this. Or if it's not as bad as someone else's loss, ever been there, mm-hmm. right? You compare yourself to someone, you go, no, they have it bad. They went through something worse than me. But when we don't honor our grief, it just stays buried. And eventually what it does, it's going to surface. And when it's surface, it's really ugly because it'll surface as anxiety. So if you're struggling with anxiety, maybe you're burying grief underneath, or maybe it comes out as anger. Out of nowhere, you get just so angry, or maybe numbness, right? You numb yourself so that you don't feel that grief.
Yeah, I was once listening to Megan Fate Marshman, who lost her husband, right? And she was talking about grief and her husband passing away, and she was talking about an ugly cry.
Oh, yeah.
And she was saying that an ugly cry is basically the ugly inside of you coming out in
so
your tears.
good.
And
so good.
yeah, I love that. That was awesome.
The pain, right? The ugliness, the things that you want to keep privately in
that
your
you want to
shower.
stuff down
Yeah.
in your body, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's just the ugly that has to come out.
Oh,
Yeah.
ugly cry. I love it.
Yeah. So let's talk about another layer of grief,
Mhm.
grieving what never happened. So maybe the childhood you didn't have, the dream that didn't come true, or the relationship that never healed.
Whoa. That's some of the heaviest grief.
Yeah.
That's pretty heavy right there. Why is that? Well, because there's no event or moment to point to. It's the quiet ache or this heartache of absence.
Mhm.
I wish this would have happened. I wish I had that, whatever that is. And if we're not careful, we can shame ourselves for even feeling it.
Yeah. And I think, coming off of Mother's Day, we have friends who haven't been able to conceive or become, we have plenty of friends that have not been able to become parents. And so having that grief, or even like for me, I know I've experienced the grief of my dad passing away and not being able to experience different moments with our kids.
Right.
Like
birthdays, Father's Day, you
Mhm.
name it, Christmas, Thanksgiving. Yeah.
So how do we give ourselves permission to grieve those unseen losses?
I know this is going to, be hard to swallow for some of you listening, but the reality is, based on our experience and again, working with so many people that God has blessed us with, you just got to be honest. You got to be honest and you have to name it. And then the hard part even is you got to sit with it and trusting that God is, he isn't intimidated by your tears, by your grief, by your sorrow. And I love what the psalmist, in Psalm 34:18 says. He says, God draws near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. I mean, I could tell you that I've been there, unfortunately, not once, but multiple times, right? With, relationship breakups to losing dreams. And, just remember that, you have to be honest, name it, and sit with it and sit with God. Because again, the promise in the scripture is that he's there. He's close to us, to those of us that have broken hearts. And if you feel crushed in spirit, know that the Lord knows. And you can have confidence in that.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say to someone who's finally letting themselves grieve, but it feels messy and never ending?
Literally off the top of my head, as you're asking that question, here it is. I'm proud of you.
Yeah.
And that's really brave of you. No one really comes up to someone that is crying their eyes out or doing an ugly cry and all that stuff and says, listen, Jenna, I'm proud of you. Like, let it go, release it. That's brave of you for, again, facing the grief, for sitting in it. And so that's what I'd say. Grief honestly doesn't follow a formula. There is just no formula. Grief comes in waves at a time, and that's okay. What matters is that you're showing up to it. You're not avoiding it, because grief, everybody, when we walk through it with honesty and hope, it actually becomes a doorway to healing. We've listened to Brene Brown. Brene Brown, check her out. She's what you call an expert in grieving. And I love all the stuff that she does. She's got a lot of stuff online, but check her out. Anyways, one of the quotes that I love that I want to quote her is, she says that, we run from grief because loss scares us. Yet our hearts reach toward grief because the broken parts want to mend. Isn't that beautiful? It's basically saying, look, our heart's desire is to be whole. We don't want to be broken. That's not the way God intended for us to be. These broken pieces, though in this life we experience that. I love what Jesus says, before he leaves, to ascend to heaven, the Bible says in Matthew chapter 28, it talks about Jesus telling his disciples, he tells them this, he said, hey, in this world, you will have trouble. He literally looks at them and says, in this world, you're going to have trouble, but he says, but take heart. Because I have overcome the world. Isn't that beautiful? What a promise of him saying, look, you're going to have stuff that's going to happen to you. You're going to go through pain and suffering, but I'm going to be with you. Don't worry. I've overcome the world, and now I will be with you, and I will help you go through it. And so remember this, that though our hearts ache and our spirit can be crushed, God understands it, right? Jesus understands it because he went through it. And so we don't have Book of Hebrews also says we don't have a high priest that doesn't empathize with us, because he knows what it is to go through when someone turns their back on you, when someone denies you, even though they were your friend for years. When you have relationships that are torn away from you, when a dream doesn't come true, Jesus experienced so many things in this world because this world is broken. It's not perfect. Mm-hmm. But yet God is with us in the midst of us, and there is peace, there is joy, there's love, and there's people, that have gone through, experienced grief themselves or are going through it, that can also comfort you.
Right. They can hold our hand.
Absolutely. We don't have to do it alone.
Right. And we just want to remind you that grief is not weakness. It's evidence that something mattered deeply. Whether you're grieving a person, a season, a dream, or even an old version of yourself, your pain is valid.
It is. And you're not grieving alone. Remember that, right? Jesus, once again, was a man of sorrows. And so he understands. And here's the promise. Here's the cool thing. Healing is possible for anyone and everyone, but it's one layer at a time.
Yeah, and if this episode hit home, be sure to come back next week. We're talking about what happens after the grief, when the dust starts to settle and you're left asking, who am I now?
Who am I now? Great question.
Yeah.
So that moment when your identity feels shaken, like I talked about a little bit earlier, right after a loss, or you've had a major life shift, or maybe a role that defined you, it comes to an end. That's what we're leaning into next week. Don't miss it. See, because God, hear me out, God doesn't just restore, he also rebuilds.
Woo. We can't wait to walk through it with you. So make sure you're subscribed, and we'll see you next Monday.
See you then.